Hello to my friends joining us via recording. We are doing some histology review, so working on talking about the different types of tissues that we find in the body. So we're going to work through as a class to identify different kinds of tissues and think of some techniques we can use when we're taking the exam to help us specifically identify these kinds of tissues. So for my friends here in class today, my question for you as we're looking at our types of tissue here, all of these types of tissue fall into the same general tissue type. We have four main types of tissue in the body. Can anyone tell me what main tissue type are all of these ones here? Yeah, a couple of us have chimed in. All of these pictures here are what we call epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue. When we talk about epithelial tissue, there are a few things for us to know about this type of tissue in general. The first thing for us to know about epithelial tissue is that it is entirely cells. Entirely cells. What I mean by that is instead of having cells and proteins like we see in connective tissue, instead of having cells that are filled with proteins, we've got little small cells, maybe lots of layers of them that are all close together. So epithelial tissue is made entirely of cells, unlike connective tissue where there's a whole bunch of proteins. And when we talk about epithelial tissue, we name epithelial tissue on two things. First, we name it based on the number of layers of cells that we see. Second, we name it based on the shape of the cells. So when I'm talking about naming my epithelial tissues based on the number of layers, let's remind ourselves of some things. So the type of epithelial tissue that I have one layer of cells, what's the word for one layer? One layer of cells. That's called, yeah, several of us are chiming in the chat, that's called simple epithelium. Simple epithelium. If I have more than one layer, what do I call it if I have at least two? What's that word? You can type it in the chat for me there. Multiple. Yeah, there we go. If I have multiple layers, I call that stratified. So more than one layer is stratified, one layer is simple. And then we've got a really weird word. The weird word, that I'm going to spell it for you because I'm not going to make you guys spell it. The weird word that I'm talking about here is called pseudostratified. Pseudostratified. This pseudo part right here means fake. Pseudostratified means fake more than one layer. This is a type of tissue that tries to make it look like there's more than one layer of cells, but there's really just one layer of cells. Everybody touches something called the basement membrane. That's basically the place where epithelial cells meet connective tissue. That's called the basement membrane. I'll give you that word over on the left. Basement membrane. When we talk about pseudostratified epithelium, everybody touches that basement membrane. Everybody touches the bottom, but they're trying to make it look like they're in more than one layer. If we have more than one layer, only the bottommost layer actually gets to touch the basement membrane. So the difference between stratified and pseudostratified, it's whether or not everybody gets to touch that basement membrane. If everybody's touching, we're pretending. If everybody's not touching, we're actually stratified. So first set of words in the names of epithelial tissues, how many layers that I have of those tissues. Second set of words in the names of these tissues are the shapes of the cells. So when I talk about the shapes of the cells, the first shape word that I have is something called squamous, or you might hear it say squamous. If you were to describe what a squamous cell looks like in the chat, what would you say a squamous cell looks like? What's its general shape? Squamous cell or a squamous cell. Okay, yeah, so Monica's saying flat and skinny. Gloria's agreeing on the flat. Yep, a squished cell. Absolutely. So when you think of a squamous cell, you're going to see cells that are pretty flat, They're going to have a dark spot in the middle. That's the nucleus. Sometimes we say they kind of look like a fried egg when we're looking at these ones up here on the top. So when we talk about squamous shaped cells, they're really flat. They're really skinny. They're squished or squashed, if you want to think about that with their name. Next name or next shape word that I have is the word cuboidal. And this one should be easy for us. When we talk about cuboidal cells, what do those ones look like? Cuboidal cells. Yeah, cuboidal cells look like cubes, right? So cubes, or it may not actually be cube shape. It may be a little bit more circular. The emphasis with a cuboidal cell is that it's going to be about as wide as it is tall. So it's going to be about as tall as it is wide. And the other thing you'll really see with cuboidal cells is their nucleus looks really big compared to the size of the cell. So cuboidal cells are about as wide as they are tall, kind of cube-shaped. Squamous cells are really flat and skinny. The last shape of cells that we have are called columnar cells. When we talk about columnar cells, how might we describe those? What do columnar cells look like? Yeah, their name kind of gives it away, right? Columnar cells kind of look like columns. So when I say columns, that's something that's really tall and skinny, right? As opposed to being the same width as they are tall, we have something that's a lot taller than it is wide. That's a columnar cell. Anytime you are looking at epithelial tissue, think in your mind about the number of layers that you see and the shape of those layers. Before you get into all the specifics where you start trying to figure out exactly which type of tissue it is, try to make some predictions in easy person words, I call it, in easy person words about things like the shape of the cells or the number of layers. If we can make those kinds of predictions, that's going to help us to match things up with their names. So let's start, since I'm pointing to it right now, let's start with examples of columnar epithelium. In the chat, can you tell me what letter or letters represents columnar epithelium? Yeah, so a few of us are chiming in. We are definitely agreeing here on B being a type of columnar epithelium. Columnar epithelium, remember, is not nearly as wide as it is tall. So this is definitely columnar epithelium. Hey, this type of columnar epithelium, if you see these dark spots, this is the nucleus of the cell. I have one line of nuclei, so one row of cells that I see right here. If I have one row of cells that I see and they're column shaped, what are those two parts of the name of this tissue? One row and column shaped cells. What are those parts of the name? Yeah, so Nicole's right. Simple columnar. Oops, simple columnar. Forgot it's R. Simple columnar epithelium. When I talk about, well, that didn't work, did it? Let's move the big word. There we go. Okay. When I talk about simple columnar epithelium, there are two options for simple columnar epithelium. The options are either that it is ciliated or non-ciliated. If I say that something is ciliated, what does that mean that it has? What does ciliated epithelium have? Yeah, it's not a trick question. Ciliated epithelium has cilia. Yeah, cilia are kind of like fingers that come off the top, or the way that we described them when we were talking about the way they look on tissues. They kind of look like eyelashes on my cells. So if I have cells, let me go down to my little sketch. We're going to add some cilia on my columnar. If I have cells that have a whole bunch of eyelashes on the top of them, that would be a type of columnar cell that is ciliated. If instead of having eyelashes, I see something, let's draw another columnar cell here. That one wasn't quite as pretty. Say instead of having eyelashes, I kind of have, ooh, that didn't work so well either. I'm failing, sorry guys. I kind of have peach fuzz on the top. If I don't have these big long eyelashes and I just kind of have something that's fuzzy on the surface of these cells, that fuzzy thing that I'm seeing on the surface of the cell is not cilia. It's actually something called microvilli. But when I'm naming my tissue that has microvilli and not cilia, instead of saying that they have microvilli, I just say they don't have cilia. So for my types of columnar epithelium that have microvilli, the word I use to describe them are non-ciliated. Non-ciliated, meaning you have microvilli or you don't have cilia, more accurately. When I look at my picture of my tissue up here, when I look at the top of these cells, does it look like I have eyelashes or peach fuzz on the top of these guys? Can we tell? Think we have eyelashes or peach fuzz? Yeah, we got the peach fuzz going on these guys. We got the peach fuzz going on these guys because compare that down here to these guys right here. You can see the individual eyelashes on the top of these cells here. So this is an example of the type of epithelium that has peach fuzz, which means it has microvilli. So my full name for this tissue up here, I would need to tack in front of it the word non-ciliated. Non-ciliated, simple columnar, and all of these types of tissue here are epithelial tissues. So the full name of this tissue I see right here, non-ciliated, simple columnar epithelium. We know it's simple because I have one line of nuclei. We know that it's columnar because these are tall and skinny cells. And we know it's non-ciliated because of the peach fuzz that I see on the top of these cells. So first type of tissue I see right here, non-ciliated, simple columnar epithelium. We also voted in the chat that tissue E right here, is another example of columnar epithelium. These cells are tall and skinny. And when I look at these cells, I can see those eyelashes on top. So we figured out a couple of things about the name of this tissue. The first thing we figured out about its name is we've got eyelashes, so we are ciliated. The second thing we figured out about its name is that it is a columnar epithelium because my cells are tall and skinny cells, excuse me. We need to figure out, though, my middle word here, my word for the number of layers. Can we take a guess in the chat? What do we think we might see going on with this tissue here? There's way more than two of us here. I got 5 votes, and we are pretty much 50-50 split between stratified and pseudostratified. So let's talk about how we tell the difference between stratified and pseudostratified. When we talk about something that is stratified, we can see distinct lines of cells. We can see one layer of cells ends and the next layer of cells begin. So typically, we looked at in our office hours this morning, we looked at some stratified cuboidal epithelium that we find in sweat glands. We could see a couple of distinct lines of cells. And I'm sorry, that's so ugly. But pretend it actually looks like cells here. We had stratified cuboidal, more than one layer of cube-shaped cells. The way that you can tell the layering pattern on cells is to look at their nuclei. So if we look at the nuclei and we see 2 distinct lines of cells or 10 distinct lines of cells, that's stratified epithelium. If we look at the nuclei in our cells, the dark spots in our cells, and they go nuts all over the place, so check out how these nuclei are all over the place. I don't have one line top and then an empty space and then another line down below. The fact that my nuclei go all over the place when I look at this particular type of tissue, that there's not just pretty lines of them, that's what happens when you're pseudostratified. So when a type of and it's only columnar epithelium, when a type of columnar epithelium is pretending like it has more than one layer, remember fake stratified, The way you see that is that the nuclei are a real mess all over the place inside the tissue. If we were, let me show you, if we were to have actually stratified columnar epithelium, what we would see instead is I would see something like this. So let me add a few cells over here. We'd see something like this, and in those cells, let's see if drawing circles works. We would see nuclei in one line and nuclei in another line. So I'd have two distinct rows of my nuclei, a top row and a bottom row. Because I have so much of a mess in my nuclei, anytime you see a mess of nuclei, you're thinking pseudostratified. So these are my two columnar tissues that we're seeing on here. Ciliated, meaning I've got eyelashes. Non-ciliated, meaning I got peach fuzz. Simple, one layer. Pseudostratified, one layer, we're pretending we look really messy. And columnar for column-shaped cells. Hey, if I bounce over here to tissue D, don't tell me its whole name, but I want you to tell me the name that relates to the shape of its cells. What kind of cells do we see in tissue type D? What kind of cells are out here? Any guesses? What shape? Yeah, so a few of us are correctly guessing. This is an example of squamous cells. Now, this type of tissue that we see here has more than one layer of cells. I can see lots of layers of cells out here. That makes this a type of stratified tissue. If you don't already know this, here's a note that you need to write down for yourself. When we are looking at stratified tissue, so tissue with more than one layer in it, we always have to look at the apical surface. We always have to look at the very top surface to figure out what shape of cell we're looking at. So when I'm looking at this tissue here, this is my connective tissue. This line where I'm seeing all these nuclei, that would be where that basement membrane is, where I go from connective tissue to epithelial tissue. So when I'm trying to figure out the shape of these cells, I look here along the top surface, the apical surface, and notice how here's a nucleus and then it's kind of a flat cell right here. Here's nucleus and another flat cell. My cells on this outermost layer out here, and my outermost layers on my way there, they're very squished, or they're very flat and skinny. This is squamous epithelium. And notice how I've got some nuclei here and some here and here and here. I definitely have more than one layer, so we are stratified. When we're talking about, let me type the words we have so far. When we're talking about stratified squamous epithelium, there are two kinds of stratified squamous epithelium. Their names are keratinized and non-keratinized. We talked about this morning. Help me out in the chat. What's the difference between keratinized and non-keratinized? Keratinized and non-keratinized. Okay, yep, so when we talk about keratinized, we've got a lot of keratin. That's a protein you're going to learn about in this week's lecture lesson. When a cell fills up with keratin, it starts to die. And dead cells don't stay attached to the rest of the cells anymore, so they start to fall apart. When I'm looking at non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, my cells are still attached. They're even still alive in that outermost layer. So check out my tissue that we're looking at right here in D. Notice how these cells are very tightly attached to their neighbors right underneath them. They're still pink and normal shaped like the other cells. These cells are still alive. So we would say that this is an example of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. let's see if that word will fit here. Non-keratinized. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Non-keratinized, just a fancy for no keratin. Now, if I fill my cells with keratin, what that's going to look like is what you see up here in tissue A. So tissue A is another example of stratified squamous epithelium because I've got lots of layers of cells, and those cells here on the very outside are really flat and skinny, but they're also, again, they're also falling off. I only fall off if I'm filled with keratin. So tissue type A is called keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Keratinized, dead cells falling off. Non-keratinized, alive and still very much attached. So these are my two types of stratified squamous epithelium. Difference between them, do you or don't you have that keratin protein? That'll tell me if you're alive or if you're dead. When I come over here and look at this tissue image that I'm looking at here, you have to get a little bit of practice of looking at this type of tissue to help you know how to interpret this image. When you're looking at this image, the type of tissue we're looking at occurs in these little rings that we can see right here. And that is a hallmark. Every time I look at this type of tissue in our lab class, you're always going to see these little circles of cells. These little circles of cells are one layer thick. What's my word for one layer? What's that word for one layer of cells? Yep, so we got simple epithelium going on here. By the way, this white space that I see right here, this is an opening. This is the apical surface, if you will, of this type of tissue. Because like someone mentioned in the chat, this kind of tissue we find in the kidneys. So this is the tube inside the kidney where when you make urine, we dump it into these little holes. So the type of cells that live next to those holes come in one layer, and these cells, as you can see in the picture, are about as wide as they're tall, or they're about as wide as they are tall. Or the big tip-off, see how large those nuclei are in each of these cells? Really large nuclei that take up a lot of space inside the epithelial cells. Those are cuboidal cells. So the picture that we're looking at up here, simple cuboidal epithelium, simple cuboidal, one layer of cube-shaped cells. Okay, we just have one type of tissue left to recognize on the slide. That is this hot mess down here. Do we have any guesses of what this hot mess is down here? Yeah, so a couple of us are correct. This messy tissue that we're looking at right here, this is called transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium makes me sad on the inside. What's up with transitional epithelium when you're thinking about its shape? What's the deal with transitional? Yeah, it's found in the bladder and the ureters. How would you describe the shape of transitional cells? Yeah, so Jacqueline's getting there. It's messy, it's involved in stretching. My hint with the stretching is when you stretch something out, its shape changes. So when we talk about transitional epithelium, oops, spelled it wrong. Transitional epithelium is a type of tissue that the cells inside of it change their shape. The best way for you to identify transitional epithelium is to look at the top surface. Notice how up here we kind of have, it's almost bumpy like a cloud would be, a cloud that's getting ready to grow bigger. So I see a bumpy surface on the outside, or I see all of these different shapes that are mixed up inside this tissue. Even on the outermost layer of this tissue, there's not just one shape of cells that I see. So when I'm looking at transitional epithelium, lots of different shapes inside the tissue. And again, that outermost layer is going to kind of look a little bit puffy, like clouds. Not like we see over here where there's a straight line on my cells. Not like we see over here where there's a straight line pretty much on the cells. These individual cells all puff out and they do all kinds of funky things with their shape. So here's a study pro tip. When you're taking a lab exam, if you're looking at a piece of tissue and it looks really messy, we can see all kinds of different epithelial cell shapes. When in doubt, if nothing else seems to fit, let's presume it's transitional, because transitional changes shape, and if it doesn't look like anything else that you know to be studying, maybe you're looking at transitional. Yeah, so there was a question in the chat what the function of transitional epithelium is. So transitional epithelium, its job is to allow organs to stretch. So we noted when we were talking about transitional epithelium that it's found in places like the bladder or the ureters. So your bladder is going to get bigger or smaller based on how much urine is inside of it. So we need to change the size of the bladder. The ureters are the tubes that connect to the bladder. So sometimes those need to stretch as well. So by having transitional epithelium, we can make the bladder and those tubes connected to the bladder get bigger or get smaller. They don't return to their shape. The question was, is that what returns them to their shape? No, that's when we start getting into that elastic tissue. The elastic fibers are all about getting things back to their right shape. But I need that transitional epithelium to have my covering layer be able to stretch with it as well. So important difference to that. Had a quick question about the number of questions and the timing. We have 50 questions on the exam, most of them with more than one part. And you have, I believe it's 75 minutes on the exam. But you should be able to see that that exam is showing up now. By the way, pro tip for you, when you go into the lab folder, if there's no words underneath where it says lab midterm exam, that means Proctorio is not working on your computer. There should be a big, long description underneath the name lab midterm exam. So if you can't see that, click on that secure exam proctor. That should activate Proctorio. Then you should be able to see all the words underneath the title of that. That's how you know Proctorio is working. So just a heads up, if there's no words underneath that title, Proctorio is logged out for some reason. It's really finicky. I'll be honest with you guys, it's super finicky because I can be in one of my Blackboard sections and Proctorio is working, and then I go to my other Blackboard section and it logs itself out. So I gotta log it back in. So just make sure to get Proctorio all set up, otherwise it's not gonna let you into that exam. All right, we talked about many of the major, not all of them, but many of the major types of epithelial tissue. If you want to keep practicing with tissues, that midterm review assignment has lots of groups of tissues that you can practice on. So these were all epithelial tissues. On my next slide here, we actually have a mix of types of tissue. My first question, which main tissue types can we see in these pictures? So epithelial tissue is one main tissue type. The other ones are muscle, nervous, connective. What do we see? Okay, a lot of us agree. We definitely have muscle tissue on here. We also definitely have some types of connective tissue on here. So let's start with the one that we all kind of agreed on. We have muscle tissue in places on this slide. Can you tell me what letters show me muscle tissue? I'm gonna make us some boxes. Which letters have muscle tissue in them? Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of B's. We seem to agree that B is muscle tissue. That's correct. Seeing a lot of E's. Also correct. And our late winner coming into is tissue C. 3 types of muscle tissue on here. Let's start with the ones that we were all most confident in. This type of muscle tissue that I see right here Which kind of muscle tissue do I see on this slide? Can we tell? What kind of muscle tissue is this one? Yeah, this is an example of my skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue. The way you're going to identify skeletal muscle tissue, check out those striations. So here, I'll zoom in just so you can see it up close. And hopefully you've looked at these a lot in the guided lesson and such. These alternating dark and light lines that I see inside this tissue, that means it is a striated muscle tissue. There are only 2 types of muscle tissue in the body that are striated. Skeletal muscle tissue is one of them. What's the other kind of muscle tissue that is striated, that has dark and light lines in it? Yeah, the other type that's striated is cardiac muscle tissue. So anytime you see a type of muscle tissue that has dark and light lines inside of it, that means it's a striated type of tissue. Striated types of tissue, only options, skeletal muscle tissue like I see here, or cardiac muscle like I see down here. So I'll label this one here, and then we'll go back and talk a little bit more about skeletal. Oh, that was terrible. Move it down. Okay. Cardiac muscle tissue down below. This is cardiac, striated type of muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue like I see up here. When I look at skeletal muscle tissue, you can see those alternating light and dark lines. But the other thing you see with skeletal muscle tissue is cells that are very long and skinny. Very long and skinny cells. So each of these are groups of protein fibers inside a muscle cell. Muscle cells are some of the longest cells in the body. When I compare a skeletal muscle cell to a cardiac muscle cell, cardiac muscle cells are not long and skinny. Cardiac muscle cells are branched, meaning they're short little cells that branch in all kinds of little directions. So if I look at this particular cell is what I'm peeking at right now. Here's its nucleus, and you can see all these places where it's connecting with other cells. It's not one long straight line. It branches in different places. And if you remember when we were talking about cardiac muscle tissue during this lab, the big thing I told you guys to look for are these right here. These dark lines that you can see in this tissue. These dark lines are things that we call intercalated discs. Intercalated discs. So the dark lines that you see in this tissue are places where cells connect to each other. I only see intercalated discs, these dark connection lines, in cardiac muscle tissue. Just like I only see these really long, skinny cells in skeletal muscle tissue. We identified that C was also an example of muscle tissue. What's that last kind of muscle tissue that I'm seeing here in image C? Yeah, what I'm seeing here in image C is smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue. Now, smooth muscle tissue, we told you in the guided lesson to make sure you compared to the type of tissue down here. What's the type of tissue in F? Can anyone tell me what kind of tissue we see down here? Any ideas? I'm going to change colors here. I'm going to make this one blue. Yeah, so this is a type of connective tissue, which is why I made it blue. This type of connective tissue that I'm seeing down here is called dense, regular connective tissue. Actually, I'm just going to put C because I'm feeling lazy. Dense, regular connective tissue. Okay, this is dense, regular, and this is smooth muscle. I want you to make a note for yourself. Please make sure that we are good at distinguishing between smooth muscle and dense, regular connective tissue. What about the ways we distinguish between them? The biggest way, the most important way that we distinguish between them is by looking at the dark spots that are in each of these kinds of tissues. When I'm talking about smooth muscle tissue, my dark spots are going to look much larger, or maybe more puffy might be a way to describe them. So notice when I look at these how they've got some width to them. Because when I go down here to look at my dark spots in dense regular connective tissue, these dark spots are squeezed really flat and really small. When we're in dense regular connective tissue, these really small black dots actually represent individual cells that are inside this tissue. We talked about this morning in our review session that the name of those dark cells that I find inside connective tissue like this, they're called fibroblasts. That means fiber builders. All of these squiggly lines inside of here are collagen. All of these little black spots that we see, or purple spots, are the fibroblast cells that build the collagen fibers. When you look at smooth muscle tissue, everything I see in smooth muscle is protein, or excuse me, is cells. I don't have proteins outside of my cells, and each of these purple spots that I'm looking at are the nuclei of those cells. So the reason that they're so much wider than the fibroblasts that we saw in our tissue down here is because this is found in the middle of my smooth muscle cells. This is their nucleus, their command center. I can't squeeze that thing or it's not going to work. So biggest difference between smooth muscle and dense regular connective tissue. Look at the size and the shape of those dots. Are they pretty puffy? Are they pretty long? Or are they almost just like polka dots? Or are they squeezed completely flat? Dense regular connective tissue has really squeezed dark spots. Smooth muscle tissue has these larger dark spots. How do we feel about comparing smooth muscle and dense regular connective tissue? Shoot me an emoji or a word or a question if we have any questions. Okay. Looks like we're feeling pretty good. Okay, so just keep comparing those. Dense regular and smooth muscle. That's an important comparison. Hey, dense regular, it's important for us to compare this one to this one over here. What kind of tissue do I see in A? What kind of tissue is this one up here? Can we tell? Draw myself another box. We have another type of connective tissue, so I'm going to put a blue box around it. Yeah, so multiple of us are correct in identifying this type of tissue. The type of tissue that I'm looking at right here is dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense, irregular. The only difference in the name of these types of tissues is whether it's irregular or regular. And we talked about this a little bit this morning. What this word refers to is how did you organize your proteins. Dense, regular connective tissue, the proteins are stacked regularly. They're all going the same direction. That's why I get these wavy lines, because all the proteins are stacked on top of each other. When I talk about dense, irregular connective tissue, my proteins are going nuts. So some of these proteins are sticking out of the screen and pointing directly at you. Some of these proteins are going the same direction as the screen. Some of these proteins are going at an angle. I don't know if any of you ever played this game. Growing up, I played the game Kerplunk a lot. My daughter plays it now. Kerplunk is a game where you stick little sticks inside a tube and you put marbles on top of it and then you pull them off, kind of like Jenga. You pull out those sticks until all the marbles fall down. But you put your sticks in at all kinds of angles. They're going nuts. They're getting messy all over the place. So dense, irregular connective tissue is like when I stick a bunch of sticks inside a tube to catch my marbles. It's going all over the place in all kinds of different directions. When I have dense, regular connective tissue, everything goes the same direction. It's all stacked neatly on top of each other. So dense, irregular connective tissue, personally, I think it's a lot uglier than dense, regular connective tissue. But it really comes down to, are we in a neat, orderly pattern, or are we in a really disjointed, weird pattern going on here? One last kind of connective tissue on my slide here. Do we know what type of connective tissue D is? What kind of are we looking at here with D? I'll put it in a blue box because it is still a type of connective. Yeah, so several of us are correct. The type of tissue that I'm seeing right here is areolar loose connective tissue. Now, I liked the vote for nervous because we're going to come back to that. Because I was looking at this picture and I was like, you know, that looks a lot like nervous. So thank you for voting that because we're going to talk about it. This particularly is areolar loose connective tissue. When I look at areolar loose connective tissue, there are a few different ways that this kind of tissue can look. But this particular view of this tissue, the way I know it's areolar, I see these dark cells that are kind of arranged all over the place. They're messy, but there's some white space on my slide. The white space on my slide tells me that it's a loose type of connective tissue. When we're doing dense, these guys were dense, right? This is dense irregular. This is dense regular. In a dense type of connective tissue, there's not open space on that part of your slide. When I look at loose connective tissue, I got some open space there. So we've got a loose connective tissue, and in between my cells, these dark spots that I see here, I have a lot of different kinds of proteins. So notice I've got some of these crisscrossing lines or this fun little squiggly one that I see right here. When I have proteins that are loosely packed together, that are kind of going all over the place, and I see these big cells like here, this is what areolar loose connective tissue looks like. So cells with loosely packed proteins, yeah, like Mike mentioned, so more wide open. Yeah, with my loose types of connective tissue, there's a lot more space. So lots of open space and these large cells. Hey, again, the cells in this picture that we're looking at are also called fibroblasts, builders. So each of these spots I see here, these are more fiber builders, fibroblast cells. Their job is to build all of these different protein fibers that we see inside of here. So we've got areolar loose connective tissue with more space, dense irregular, and dense regular connective tissue. And we've got three types of muscle tissue that we see here. Now, I want you to think about and to look at this picture here that shows us the areolar loose connective tissue, because I want us now to mentally compare that to nervous tissue. So let me check out my slides here. I think my next one, let me go all the way down here. We went nuts here. We got a whole lot of pictures. But can you guys tell, before I zoom in, can you guys tell where there is nervous tissue on this page? Yeah, so a bunch of us are in. I have two places with nervous tissue. First place that most of us are agreeing on, D, that shows me nervous tissue. And the other one that several of us noticed is K, that's nervous tissue there as well. So when I'm looking at my types of tissue here, nervous tissue is the one type we haven't talked about at all yet. Let me zoom in a little bit just to show you. When we talk about nervous tissue, one of the best ways to identify it is the color that I see, the colors. In nervous tissue, my cells are always dark in color, dark blue. My cells also have really funky looking shapes. So those cells, we're going to get really good, by the way, in unit number 3 at drawing neurons. Okay, so some of us are saying it's not zooming. Sorry. I'm pointing at D, so if you can mentally zoom, we're looking at D here. When I talk about nervous tissue, we're gonna work on drawing these cells when we are in unit number 3, because we're gonna talk all about these guys here. But when you look at nervous tissue cells, they have a really large cell body, and then they've got extensions that go off of that cell body. So when we're looking at nervous tissue, okay, so some people are saying they're getting it to zoom in. Awesome. Oh, somebody else has got a pointer. Take off that pointer for me if you can. confuse our friends watching via video. So when you're looking at nervous tissue, dark cell body that's blue, and then we see a lot of pink space around it. The other thing with nervous tissue is if you notice the little blue dots that we're looking at on the outside of the big ones, those little blue dots are things that are called neuroglia. Neuroglia. That's the little blue dots that you see scattered in the pink part. Those are called neuroglia. If I go down to my other nervous tissue picture, you can see the neuroglia a lot better. See this blue mass that's inside of here? We've got a few really big dark blue neurons. That's the name of the nervous tissue cells that do thinking. And then I've got a whole lot of these light blue neuroglia that are much smaller. They help to keep the neurons alive. So a note for you to make for yourself in general, when we're looking for nervous tissue, always look for a pink background with blue cells. Really large blue cells that are the neurons, and maybe some little blue polka dot cells mixed into the pink stuff as well. So type of tissue that we hadn't looked at yet when we were looking at our types of tissue is that nervous tissue. Nervous tissue, dark blue cells, and then the little blue polka dots that go with it. Again, dark blue cells and little polka dots that go with it. Several of the types of tissue on this slide we've actually already talked about. We have not talked about tissue C. Any takers here? What kind of tissue is this one up here, tissue C? Any ideas? Yeah, so we're correct. We are looking at, in tissue type C, is called fibrocartilage. All of my cartilages, by the way, are a type of connective tissue. So fibrocartilage, connective tissue. Fibrocartilage is another type of tissue that the best way to recognize it is its color. So in fibrocartilage, you're going to see squiggly blue lines that represent my protein fibers, and these bright pink spots that represent my cells. So fibrocartilage is always blue with pink spots in it. Nervous tissue, as a foil for that, is always pink with blue spots. So they're opposite color schemes, but they are both types of tissue recognized by their color. So fibrocartilage gets its name because it has so many protein fibers. Those protein fibers stain blue when I put them on a slide. So fibrocartilage is what I see up here at the top with those protein fibers, those blue proteins that I see. By the way, this is a type of cartilage tissue. When I'm looking at cartilage tissue, does anyone happen to remember the name of cartilage cells? Cartilage cells, yeah. Cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. Chondrocytes. Chondro always means cartilage. So fibrocartilage connective tissue, these pink spots that I see inside of here, these are chondrocytes. They're cartilage cells. Let's see. We also technically have not talked about this type of tissue yet. I know it's not the best picture in the world, but can we tell what type of tissue tissue J is? Yeah, so we are correct. It's not an awesome picture, but this is an example of adipose loose connective tissue. Adipose loose connective tissue. I say that this one is loose because there are no proteins in between my cells. I only have cells that I find in adipose loose connective tissue. We should know from lecture that the name of those cells are called adipocytes. Each of these circles that you kind of see in my picture here, those are adipocytes. They're fat cells. So adipose tissue is another type of connective tissue. It is a loose connective tissue, and we can remember that based on the fact that loose connective tissues have much fewer fibers, much fewer proteins inside of them. I have those dense connective tissues again. Which letter on my panel here represents dense irregular connective tissue? Which one is dense irregular connective tissue? Yep, awesome. Dense irregular is letter G right there. So dense, meaning I've got a lot of proteins. Irregular, meaning those proteins are a mess and it's a type of connective tissue. Dense irregular connective tissue. Where do I have dense regular connective tissue? Can we find dense regular? Yeah, dense regular. This guy right here, dense regular connective tissue. So I'll put that name. Yeah, and remember, dense just means there's a lot of proteins. Regular means they're arranged regularly in the same pattern. Let's see. Which of my pictures, when I'm looking at them, shows me cardiac muscle tissue? Which one is cardiac muscle tissue? Excellent. That's this one down here. Letter L is cardiac muscle. Hey, letter E is a different version of a type of tissue that we looked at. Can anyone tell what kind of tissue we see here in letter E? Yeah, so this is muscle tissue. It is in particular that skeletal muscle tissue. I'll change to black to type its name. This is, let me type it, skeletal muscle tissue. This is the other way that skeletal muscle tissue can look. This is my more favorite way that skeletal muscle tissue looks. This is one individual cell that I can see here. Here's another individual cell, and there's one over here. Yeah, it does kind of look like hair, right? The way that hair would look on a microscope. When I'm looking at these skeletal muscle cells, the reason that this is my favorite view of it is see all of these little dots that I see on this type of tissue here? All of these little dots that I'm looking at are nuclei. When we talk about skeletal muscle tissue, I have a word to describe my skeletal muscle cells. That word is called multinucleate. Multinucleate. What that word means is there's more than one nucleus in the cells. So all of these black spots are all nuclei in the same single cell right here. Multinucleate, more than one nucleus. So remember, skeletal muscle tissue we looked at on the previous slide. You can see those striations really well. Or if we're seeing this version of skeletal muscle tissue, your big tip-off is going to be all these nuclei that I see. I like to jokingly call them the ants on the log. So if you see ants on a log type of tissue with all these little ants that are crawling on the log, we're looking at skeletal muscle tissue. This one up here we've kind of seen before, we talked about before. What type of tissue was A? Tissue type A. We just looked at this one. Yep, A up here is another type of muscle. So it's my smooth muscle tissue up here. Let's add that name, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle up top. This one right here is another one that we've talked about. Check out those nuclei going nuts. They're all over the place. What's that layering word for my nuclei go nuts? They're all over the place. Yep, pseudostratified. Pseudostratified. In your guided lesson, we called that fake it till you make it, right? Pseudostratified. And these guys, we correctly pointed out, have eyelashes on top. Circling those eyelashes for you. So these eyelashes up here are my cilia. So ciliated, got lots of cilia. Pseudostratified, and these are column-shaped cells, so columnar epithelium. Ciliated, pseudostratified, columnar epithelium. And a picture over here. We are back to those little circles of cells. Back to those circles. Which kind of tissue do I see here in eye? Which kind of tissue is this one? Yep, there is my simple cuboidal epithelium. Perfect. I guess the one we haven't talked about is B. Up here, B. Can we tell what kind of tissue we're seeing up here in image B up here? What kind of tissue is that one? Yep, so we are non-keratinized because all my cells are alive. And I have lots of layers of these cells. So the word for lots of layers was stratified. So big long name for B here is non-keratinized, stratified. I'm gonna have to abbreviate. Stratified. If I look at that top layer, they're very flat. So it's non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Non-keratinized, stratified, squamous. How do we feel about these? Thumbs up, thumbs down, dancing emoji. How are we feeling about these ones? Okay, Monica's feeling a little better. Nicole's feeling good. Got to give you guys my penguin, right? For those of you here this morning, my penguin was on point, don't you think? He did really well. He was awesome. They don't usually look that good. All right, let me look at my slides. Let's go back one slide here. Yeah, Monica says now she's got to work on those locations and functions. Definitely. Yep. Now is the time. If you can start associating pictures with locations and functions, that helps too. Yeah, Stephanie is shouting out Quizlet. Yes, Quizlet is great. As long as you can make your Quizlet flashcards fast, because that exam is due in what, like 18 hours. So please don't spend 5 hours building a Quizlet. Only build Quizlet stuff for the things that you really don't know, that you want to get a lot of practice with. So yeah, shout out for Quizlet. Great resource. When I look at this slide here, we got some more tissue images here. Which main tissue types can we see on this slide? Which ones do we see here? What ideas do we have? Okay, so Mike says we got some cartilage. That's a type of connective tissue. Okay, so I got some connective tissue. Any other types of tissue, or is it all connective tissue? What do we think? Yeah, so bone is a type of connective tissue, actually. A couple of us did notice that the other main tissue type that we got on here, we have some nervous tissue on here as well. We have nervous tissue. Which letter is my nervous tissue? Let's start with that one because it's the odd man out. Yeah, nervous tissue is my tissue that I see here in D. D is an example of nervous tissue. Nervous tissue, again, remember we've got those big blue cells and we see some smaller blue cells mixed in with it as well. Again, these are called neurons, my thinking cells, and these guys are called neuroglia, my helper cells. So this is nervous tissue, like I see here. Everybody else that I'm looking at on this slide is some type of connective tissue. 3 of my images on this slide are in the same kind of category. Can anyone figure out what I'm talking about here? 3 of them are in the same category. Yeah, so the ones that are in the same category are A, B, and E. Yeah, the category that A, B, and E all fall into, these are all my types of cartilage connective tissue. When I look at cartilage connective tissue, remember, we've got those cells, let me switch my color again, those cells called chondrocytes. Cells called chondrocytes in cartilage tissue. So I'm here looking at, I'm gonna look at these top 2 cartilages to start, to mention for you that these 2 types of cartilage, their chondrocytes look a particular way. Notice how these cartilage cells, these chondrocytes, come in groups of 2. So we like to call this kind of cartilage up here, I told you guys to think about it kind of like deer tracks in the snow. So my groups of chondrocytes kind of look like a hoof print from a deer, and they're walking around, there's nothing behind them. So there's this pink stuff in the background. There's no proteins inside of it, or very small proteins, put it that way. Which of the specific types of cartilage do we see here, by the way? What's the name of this one? Yeah, this is my hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. So again, hyaline cartilage is the one that I want you to think about, like I said, kind of like deer tracks in the snow. So my groups of chondrocytes that are surrounded by light pink, that's hyaline cartilage. When I come over to my second type of cartilage over here, I can still see large chondrocytes. So still seeing them kind of in groups of two, or these really large cartilage cells. But what's different between B and A is the color. Notice this purple that I see on here. Yeah, so I told you guys, every time you see purple, immediately in your mind, you are thinking elastic proteins. So let's make a note of that. Elastic proteins equal purple. So anytime we see dark purple, that means I have elastic proteins in my tissue. If I have dark purple that's next to these big, large chondrocyte cells, then I'm looking at elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage. So if you see purple proteins by cartilage cells, by chondrocytes, that's elastic cartilage. What if, let's go over here to C, what if I see those purple proteins but no chondrocytes? What kind of tissue am I seeing right here? Do we know? Yeah, so the tissue I'm seeing in C is the one kind of tissue that somebody told me they wanted to see. What we're looking at right here is called dense elastic connective tissue. Dense because it has a lot of proteins inside of it. Elastic because some of those proteins are purple. So again, in case we didn't already know this or didn't already write this down, anytime you see purple, automatically you should be thinking elastic. Whether it's elastic cartilage because I have these big chondrocyte cells, or whether it's just dense elastic connective tissue because I only see proteins, purple proteins and some pink. That, by the way, is collagen. So I've got collagen and elastic proteins. When I see those guys mixed together, that's dense elastic connective tissue. We already talked about this one right here. Remind me again, what kind of tissue is E down here? What kind of tissue are we looking at down here? Yep, this down here in E is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage, my last kind of cartilage tissue. And again, like we talked about, those squiggly blue lines, those are my fibers that make this kind of cartilage tissue so strong. So fibrocartilage, a very strong kind of cartilage tissue. When we're learning where I find it, two good places to learn that we find it. Let me type them out. Intervertebral discs, as in the cartilage between the vertebrae of your spine. Also a place called the pubic symphysis. We are learning the pubic bones that's in the front of the hips. The cartilage that connects them together is called fibrocartilage. So two places that I find this fibrocartilage where it's really, really strong. Hey, hyaline cartilage, one of my favorite places to know hyaline cartilage is the fetal skeleton. So all the bones in your body, or almost all the bones in your body, started out as hyaline cartilage, turned into bone tissue. That's what we're talking about next week in lecture, is the process that our body uses to take hyaline cartilage and turn it into bone tissue. Speaking of bone tissue, we got some bone tissue going on over here. Which kind of bone tissue do we see right here? What kind is F? Yeah, so F over here is an example of spongy bone. Spongy bone, that's technically a type of connective tissue, spongy bone. The way I know it's spongy bone is I have this stuff right here. This is my bone marrow. and then I can see my bone tissue here in pink. So the bone tissue in spongy bone, we have to know this from lesson number 6. It's arranged in things called trabeculae. Trabeculae means little beans or little fingers. So here's my little fingers of the bone tissue here, trabeculae, and they're surrounded by bone marrow. I mentioned this morning, but when you look at the guided lesson, make sure to pay attention. There's 2 kinds of spongy bone images that we see. Some of them just have red in this bone marrow area, and some of them will have like purple pink in this bone marrow area. But anytime you look at spongy bone, you're always going to see an area where there's solid tissue, that's the bone tissue, and then you're going to see a mass of little cells that are all grouped together. That's the bone marrow. So spongy bone has the bone marrow in it, and then it has the bone tissue arranged in trabeculae. All right, I got one last set of tissue images for us to look at together. Here's my last one right here. We have talked about all of these types of tissue. So this could get super crazy, but I don't even care. Up above my pointer right here, there's a little T. I want us to take a stab at labeling these types of tissue. So if you click on that T, pick a color like black. So like you click on the T, you'll see a colored circle, pick black. Let's go through, type the names of these tissues above them and the names of these ones below them. I know we're going to type all over there, but go ahead, everybody here in class, pick a type of tissue and type its name for me. What kinds of tissues can we recognize here? Ooh, someone's writing. Awesome. You're braver than me. It's too hard to write. Good. Looks like we are getting names on all of them. And the good news too is it looks like we agree on our names on all of them. So that's always a good thing too. Awesome. Okay, so let's chat because it looks like we have labeled them. So my first type of tissue that I see up here, my tissue type A, this is my other way that areolar loose connective tissue looks. So there are 2 colors that you can see areolar loose connective tissue. Sometimes areolar looks pink. All of the proteins are pink. Sometimes those proteins are kind of this darker blue color that we see. So this is my other version of areolar loose connective tissue. Again, check out that guided lesson in lesson number 4 because it puts the pink one and this blue one side by side. Areolar loose connective tissue. Next door neighbor is dense irregular connective tissue. It's dense because look at all of these proteins, right? So many proteins everywhere. Irregular because those proteins are arranged in a mess. We're seeing all over the place. I have a colleague who said this kind of looks like a Van Gogh painting where there's kind of swirls inside of it. So dense irregular connective tissue, it's a big mess. There's proteins going all over the place. Compare that to dense regular that lives next door. Now remember, when I'm looking at dense regular connective tissue, I can see my proteins that are in this wavy pattern here. And then check out my squished fibroblast cells. They're all squished small in between those proteins. So fibroblasts are the dark spots in dense regular connective tissue. They're squeezed really flat compared to down here in smooth muscle where they're much larger. So I can see them a lot more clearly. They're not squeezed outside the cells. They're actually in the very middle of the cells. So smooth muscle here, dense regular connective tissue up above it. We go next door neighbor here. This is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified squamous because there's multiple layers and the cells on the outside are flat. Non-keratinized because they're not falling off. they're still all attached. And that last kind of tissue, it's that picture we keep looking at, right? This is my fibrocartilage. So bright blue with those pink spots inside of it, that is fibrocartilage connective tissue. That is all I've got. What questions do we still have? Or are there any particular types of tissue you want to see before we call it a night? Or shoot me an emoji if you're feeling how you're feeling. Good, bad, or ugly. Yes, you're welcome, Hannah. Glad that this was helpful. Nicole asked if the slides will be off of the Google Drive. Generally speaking, yes. So she's mentioning that from SI today there was a weird looking cardiac muscle slide. What I'll say for you is you might want to consider doing a Google Images search for some of these types of tissue as well, as kind of a last check for yourself. If it was a brown and gray slide, I'm not familiar exactly with that one, so that might have been something that either came from online or maybe from the slides in AMP2. But I would think that some of the same structural features would be there, right? Did that one have, could you see those intercalated discs, for example? Or the branching cells or the striations? Generally speaking, regardless of exactly what a slide looks like, there should be the same anatomical features there. Yeah, so if it was hard to see, Nicole, just know that when we created our midterm exam, we are trying to pick the best possible pictures. So whether it's pictures from the Google Drive or whether it's pictures that you haven't seen in the Google Drive, for cardiac muscle, for example, you will definitely be able to see intercalated discs. For skeletal muscle, we'll definitely see those striations. So even if it's not the exact same picture you see in the Google Drive, just know that we will pick a good picture to include in there. We're going to do our best not to trick you up just because it's a bad picture. Yeah, there was a request for reticular up earlier. We didn't actually look at a picture of that one, so let me pull that up really fast to show you guys. There was a question in the chat if we recorded everything, and the answer to that is yes. So as soon as we finish our class session, I gotta wait on my computer to process our recording, and then I gotta wait on YouTube to process it. But as soon as everybody's done processing, I will get it posted for you with all that time. Let me find, bear with me, I'm scanning my slides for reticular. Okay, let me share my screen with you guys to show you reticular. Okay, here is reticular connective tissue. Let me make this smaller so that maybe it'll make it a little bit bigger. When I'm looking at reticular connective tissue, the way you're going to identify it is see in these spaces inside here how it almost looks like there's like a mesh pattern inside here. So that mesh is my reticular proteins. Reticular proteins, their big deal is that they're the branching type of proteins. So they act kind of like a net to catch things. So all of these little branching proteins that I see inside of here, these are my reticular proteins. Just as an FYI, these dark spots that I see inside of here, these are actually white blood cells. So this particular slide comes from the spleen, where we're doing some filtering, where we're pulling out the bad guys that are floating in your bloodstream. So the reticular proteins help us with filtering, find them in places like the lymph nodes and the spleen. So you can see those branching proteins here. I think I have another one that's pretty similar. Again, you can see even some darker branching proteins up here. So all of these little branching proteins are reticular proteins. I know I saw one other one. Let me pull that up too. It's not as pretty as that one. Here's my other reticular image. I know I got some student questions about this one. This one isn't quite as clear, but if you look closely, so I'm zooming way in here, you see how there's this little line in between here and it's kind of running over here. What I'm seeing on this slide is a whole lot more cells. All of these dark spots are cells, and the little reticular proteins are in between them. So it's not as, again, it's not as clear as that other one was. You could really see those proteins on the other one. But as a heads up, when you're going through and you're looking at the different slides, this is my not favorite reticular connective tissue, but it is reticular. My favorite one, again, let me scroll down, is right here. So this one is a much easier way to see all of those different reticular proteins that are mixed inside there. Any other types of tissue that we wanted to make sure to take a peek at? I apologize. You might be able to hear my 4-year-old background. She's having a moment. Well, here's my question in closing then. When are we thinking we are going to take the exam? Any of us going to do it tonight? Mostly tomorrow? What are we thinking? Tonight? Yeah, Jacqueline, that is that's putting it kindly that she's cheering you on. We'll go with that. We'll say that she's cheering you on for sure. Yeah, lots of us taking it tomorrow morning. Awesome. Some of us taking it tonight. Perfect. Well, I mentioned this morning, and I'll say it one more time. If you have any trouble with the exam, if it kicks you out accidentally for some reason, please get in touch with Proctorio first. They are going to be able to get you back into the exam. I can't really do that. I can't reload the exam without having to clear out all of your work. So if it happens to die on you for some reason, if your internet dies, I put a link on our announcements and our Blackboard page of how to get in touch with Proctorio. So live chat with them right away. They can look at your test, they can see when your internet died, and they can get you back into that test. So get in touch with them. If for some reason they can't help you, then you can get in touch with me too, but I can't do quite as much as they can. So definitely start with them. Yeah, Monica's talking about when taking the exam when someone's there to watch the littles. Yeah, my littles are they're dying. So yeah, and we mentioned this morning, thank you for that reminder, Keenan. If you are a MacBook user, make sure to put your MacBook in Do Not Disturb. I did have a couple students that they had something pop up. Totally not trying to cheat, but something popped up because they were using their MacBook. So if you have a MacBook, make sure before you start your exam, put it in Do Not Disturb so that it doesn't boot you out on accident. All right, well, let me give you, I did it this morning. I'll do it one more time because lots of us, I actually probably won't see most of you before you take your exam. Let me give you one more wishing you well penguin here. So for my friends taking the exam tonight and for all friends taking the exam tomorrow, you can think of our little penguin friend here. Our little penguin friend is going to tell you guys best of luck. So best of luck from my penguin friend, from me, from my daughter who we're going to pretend is cheering you on and not having a toddler temper tantrum. I will stick around in the chat if you guys have any last minute questions, but yeah, again, best of luck on the exam. I will be here open office hours, not going to do anything scheduled, but open office hours tomorrow at noon. So if there are any particular last minute questions you have, feel free to stop by. I'll be here live to help answer those. Otherwise, again, good luck on the exam, and hope to see some of you guys on Wednesday when we start covering lecture stuff. So good luck on that exam.